Greetings, war friends. Today, let us take a look at this new offering by Balaur Arms, the Irish two-handed sword. You'll notice the change of scenery from my usual review on the patio, and I have to give a little bit of explanation on this, but also some update on the status of my channel. You see, I just suffered an injury on my lower back and hip, the back of the hip. Went to the hospital and doctors examined me and explained that it's due to overuse of the muscle group. So I guess I would just have to give it some rest, avoid doing repeated exercise to stress the muscle anymore, and take it easy on the thrusting exercise, if you know what I mean.
The following morning, Luther never made it down the stairs to propose to my sister because the boy couldn't bloody walk.
So I'm gonna have to record this video in one go and do very little editing, because probably you have noticed that my usual video has heavy editing, lots of close-up elements and also footage pieced together. Right now, doctors prescribe less than 10 minutes of sitting time per hour. So there's no way I can edit the video up to my usual standards. The other thing is that in this video, I will only review this, the build quality, fit and finish, historicity of the sword. Not gonna do any cutting because of my current health, but also the apexing of this edge is simply not there for practice cutting. I refuse to use this kind of edge to do cutting. It doesn't do justice to the quality of the sword. You see, the edge geometry is beautiful, right? There's no secondary bevel or anything, but the apexing is simply not there. You can see I can feel the edge very thin, but I can comfortably glide my fingers up and down without being cut. And I have a few videos already shot, just waiting to be edited. You know, the LB and Sovereign review, Claw Hammer European Longsword, but also LK Chen 倭腰刀 and Tang Dynasty 斩马刀. So that will have to be pushed back a little bit. I apologize to the people who sent me those review samples. I think this is an excellent offering, right? Captures the stereotypical Irish two-handed sword in the geometry and design element of the hilt. So lots of people already asked me about this model, which is new, just been released in July, along with the Renaissance side sword, and both of these are made by LK Chen. And right now I just give it a little bit of thought on the side sword, because I didn't get that one, but I'm happy to opine on the design of that sword. I have no doubt that that sword is going to be wonderful in the build quality, you know, mass distribution, handling, everything, the performance, if you sharpen the edges well. But I'm not so sure about its historicity. You see, I'm the kind of person that takes historicity very seriously. There is some room for interpretation, artistic license, but if there's just too much for the leap of faith, usually I'm just gonna skip on the offering altogether, even if the sword can be a very good one. And I think it's kind of weird of a design choice to marry a blade to a hilt of two different region of origin, but also time period. The hilt is seen commonly on side swords from the early 16th century. If you go to Doge's Palace in Venice, you go to the armory section, you're going to see loads of early side swords with this kind of hilt. But almost all of them have type 19, oakshot type 19 blades. So almost exact same one on LK Chen's Rebaudo, and I have no idea why Cartesianus designer chose to hilt this style onto a blade with almost like a oakshot type 18 blade. We know that LK Chen has already done two models. One is the Rebaudo of type 19 blade, which if you put a blade on this hilt, it'll be just, you know, chef's kiss, perfect, right? And I have no idea why I choose to use the blade that's previously seen on LK Chen's Munich tongue guard. You see, at the Doge's Palace in Venice, you also see lots of Type 18 blades on side swords, but those are from later periods, you know, and usually from southern German regions. So it just makes the model an odd combination of the blade and hilt, kind of like a bastard sword. I have no doubt this sword is going to be amazing in terms of handling and performance. And if you don't care about the historicity, go for it, okay? Because it's going to be one of the best Renaissance sword, you know, reproduction out there. So that's kind of the justification for not getting that model. And this one, however, the Irish Greatsword or two-handed sword, is just a fantastic offering with loads of features, both on the blade and on the hilt, as perfectly representative of 15th and 16th century Irish two-handed swords. First, let's examine the scabbard before we dispense with it. You see, this is a very slender, very form-fitting wood core scabbard. Fits the blade perfectly, not being overly bulky, but also you can see a lenticular cross-section on the scabbard to mirror the lenticular cross-section on the blade. The retention is okay, draw is very smooth, but it's a little bit rattly and loose, you can see. So just be careful of that. But also, when you get this one, you might not have the same, you know, experience. Maybe it's rather tight, so it varies from piece to piece. And you can see on the ring flap, you know, of the leather wrapping, there is the Celtic cross etched onto the leather, which I like a lot. There are 3 risers on the scabbard, so if you want to do any belt suspension, you can install that onto the scabbard. And you can see it has a pretty attractive, though simple, steel shape. It also has a clover perforation on the steel. So let's dispense with the scabbard and talk about the sword. You can see this blade is highly atypical, right? Very rare on the reproduction market. I simply don't understand why. You see, it has a very unique lenticular cross-section throughout without any fuller. Although this type of blade, especially with this profile, the silhouette without too much profile taper, is very typical to many medieval swords, particularly Scottish swords, Irish swords, Byzantine swords, and some Middle Eastern swords like Arabic saif. And you almost never find this kind of blade on the reproduction market. Usually, when they try to implement it, they do it wrong and have a central ridge. This blade does not have a central ridge. It's a perfect lenticular cross-section from the base to the tip. Although if you look at the lower portion of the blade, you might mistake this slightly raised section for a medial ridge. And it's not actually a ridge, it's just slightly higher than the rest of the blade. If you use your finger to touch it, you will not find a solid edge, right? And under certain lighting, it feels like there's an edge, like a central ridge, but there's not. And this is a perfect convex grind from the thickest section of the blade down to the edge. You will feel there's a like lenticular cross-section convex grind. And on the upper portion, the raised central section become less pronounced, eventually just blending into a like stereotypical medieval swords lenticular cross-section. So beautiful one singular primary bevel. Okay, there's no secondary bevel, and the section behind the edge is thin but somewhat reinforced. You can imagine like a lenticular cross-section has this apple seating geometry. You like the surface of the blade, very flat, very well ground, tiny amount of rippling, and which is okay. You know, this is probably already better than most of the original medieval swords. in today's, reproduction swords as well. And you can see the blade is reasonably broad, even though it doesn't really feel that way, because if you just look at the picture, the sword is so in proportion that you feel this is almost like a smaller sword. But if you look at the size, it rests on the ground, it just reach, just below my sternum, about 2 inches from my sternum. By the way, the overall length is 53 inches, so pretty large sword, even though it's not as big as the Albion Maximilian there. And the blade is 38 inches long, 96.5 centimeters. So this is definitely a two-handed sword. By the way, this grip alone is 11 inches long, so 27.5 centimeters. And everything on this hilt is huge, right? Very wide crossguard with this large, almost like a spatulate or like a spoon. It's curved inward this way and outward this way. It doesn't matter which way you hold it. So this is very representative of many medieval Irish swords. You can see also there is one clover perforation on each extremity of the quillon. Although there is a transition from this flattened area to this central bar. If you go to the Irish National Museum in Dublin, you see many of these ring pommel medieval Irish swords there. If you look at the detail on the crossguard, you see there's no such a knot and the transition from this flattened area to the bar. Usually it's like a sheet of metal rolled inward to create some kind of a tube to reinforce the strength of the crossguard. Does this transition bother me? Not really that much, because you can see this S-shaped guard, clover perforation, and this geometry are still very representative of Irish swords. And also, it correctly has this central ridge or beak. So, well done. Just a lot of attention to detail in terms of the design. And of course, you cannot have an Irish sword without the iconic ring pommel. Okay, this pommel has so much going on, and we have to break it down one by one. There's a common mistake by modern reproductions that's making the ring pommel on Irish swords overly thick. And you should not do that. If you look at a National Museum of Ireland swords, they all have very thin rings as a pommel. And this one, pommel is pretty thin. I can see about 5 to 6 millimeters in thickness. But there's also a lot more going on here. If you look at the outer rim of this ring, you see it's hollow ground. And this is rarely seen on reproductions. If you look at this sword over here, this is the Lockwood Gallowglass longsword. A bit smaller than this one. And you can look here. Definitely not just the blade shorter and narrower. The hilt is significantly shorter. The entire hilt, right? The rings, the grip, every one of them is smaller than this Balaur arm example. If you look at the ring pommel, it doesn't have a lot of geometry. It's just a flat ring. But on this Balaur arm example, you can see the outer rim is hollow ground, and this dimension, this facet of the guard, is also slightly domed. So this way, all the edges are rounded, and also the angle is not very sharp, so there's no discomfort at all. Even the pin block at the end of the sword, all the corners, all the edges are rounded perfectly. So you can even grab onto this guard. There's nothing that's really poking into your flesh, which is a direct contrast with this Lockwood Irish longsword. That sword, is my favorite cutting sword, period. There's so much joy, right, cutting with that sword. But problem is the fittings have lots of sharp corners, so you have to be very careful handling it. This Balaur arm example by LK Chen really nails the ergonomics of the hilt components. Nothing. Everywhere you see the edges are chamfered, corners are rounded. Although there's 2 minor criticisms, and they can be easily fixed. Look at the grip dimension, right? Usually LK Chen, when they make European swords, usually have an oval cross-section in the grip. Very comfortable, right? Dimension, sizing, just perfect for most people. This one, they chose a hexagonal cross-section. So you can see there's a central ridge on this side of the grip. So it divides the surface into 2 facets, but also on the side is flat. So you have 6 facets on the entire grip. Problem is that the side facets, you see, it's very thin. So you hold this grip. The dimensions are okay, right? The thickness and the width are both fine. But since the side facets are too thin, when you hold on to it, it kind of dig into your finger, right? It's just not very comfortable. I think LK Chen can look at some of the hexagonal cross-section grips on premium makers such as Albion. You can see the hexagonal grip on my Albion Regent. You can find the side facets. It's a perfect thickness. So there's no discomfort at all when you handle it. Of course, you can wear gloves when you handle the sword, but I don't like having less connection when you wear gloves. So this can be, fixed rather easily. The other minor critique is that even though the leather wrapping over the wooden core is done very well with 2 risers, but also cord wrap impression, so it's not under wrap, right? It's just you wrap the leather with cord and you apply glue, you settle it for some time, and you unravel the cord. There's just these impression, creating these textures. Has a lot of traction when you hold on to the grip. All very well done, but you can see still, right, after 2 years making European swords with grip of this style, at the transition, the leather wrapping, right, here, transition to the crossguard, transition to the pommel, are still not tucked in. If you look at it, today's premium reproductions like Albion, Angus trim swords, their leather wrapping are always tucked inside. So people just notice in the leather, the back side of the leather is undyed, and they usually say, "Oh, this is not correct. You have to dye it on both sides." That's not true, right? Like, leather should not be dyed on both sides. All you have to do is just to tuck this in when you craft the grip. Okay. Does it really matter in terms of functionality when you use the sword? Not really. I just think this is just a tiny detail, which can be easily fixed by LK Chen. He has all the capable craftsmen. So another thing you have to, be aware of is this very unique Irish style of crossguard. You see, it's not like flare or swept upward or downward, but with this flattened geometry, if you do chamber back motion, usually when you try to increase the strike distance to accelerate, you tend to do this first and then strike forward, right? So you have the tip of the blade has a longer trajectory, so it has more distance to accelerate the blade. If you do that with this sword, it's gonna dig into your forearm, and even though the corner is rounded, it's not gonna be comfortable, right? And bam, right, dig into the flesh of your forearm. But this is just, the quirk of this style of crossguard. It's not really LK Chen's fault. Other than that, there's nothing really to criticize. The peen on the peen block is very well done. Not perfectly symmetrical, but it definitely serves the purpose and is very prominent. You can see it here. It's also ground flush with the peen block, so there's nothing that sticks out that can latch onto your clothing or skin. Just very well executed. You can also see the tan going out into the ring pommel. It's properly narrow and thin, so the tan is tapered right inside the grip. Just perfect. And one major critique of this sword is what I mentioned earlier, the apexing of the edge. You see the edge geometry is beautiful, right? Really well executed, but the sharpness is simply not there. And this is a very common problem for even many of the premium makers. I'll just drop a few names like Albion, Angstrom. Their blades have edges that's sometimes properly sharp, but not even really razor sharp, which medieval swords should be. You know, when you think about it, this kind of sword is used by heavily armored infantry, like Gallowglass. Gallowglass means foreign warrior, right? Very just battle-hardened Irish mercenaries, usually wearing heavy mail armor, because Irish people didn't wear plate armor at the time for some reason. They prefer mobility, range of motion over full protection. So Gallowglass warriors are kind of like a shock troop, right? That deploy to charge into enemy ranks against people with less armor, or mostly just wearing clothes and gambison, you know, holding polearms or archers. Again, this kind of cleaving swords is really put into maximum usage to deadly efficiency. Of course, still, even though they don't have metal armor, they wear very protective gambison clothing. Fabric requires very sharp edges to cut through, right? Especially when these close armor just have layers, sometimes dozens of layers of hardened linen. It's really difficult to cut through, so you really need very keen edges. Of course, like I said earlier, this edge is almost done, right? If I have to rate it, the apexing, I'll give it a 5 out of 10, which is a fail for regular practice cutting. If I use this to cut, you know, the regular targets, tatami mats, water bottle, you know, plastic or paper ones, it just wouldn't do very well because, you know, the apexing isn't there. That alone can ruin your cutting experience. But it doesn't take a lot of time. You know, if I'm not injured right now, I can just whip out my work sharp and give it a go. Probably 5 to 10 passes with high grit should do. That would mar the blade a little bit, but it will just improve its performance by 10 folds, you know, even 100 folds. LK Chen usually output sharp edges, but they have a consistency issue. And I don't know why. Sometimes it's like the Balaur Alexandria sword, they made the mistake of making metal locket onto the throat of the scabbard, but this one doesn't have that. It's just a wooden scabbard with ring flap. It's just very well executed, so there's no metal bits at the throat to dull your edges when you draw it. There's no excuse for you to not provide razor sharp edge, which we know LK Chen makers, craftsmen are able to output. I don't understand. Like, I own 16 LK Chen pieces, right? The same number as my Albion swords, right? Also 16 swords. So you can see that Albion and LK Chen are my favorite makers. But both of them have this problem, that just edge sharpness, consistency. I have to say that personally, I had to sharpen at least 8 of them for them to even reach a level of cutting ready, right? Sometimes they come just with very dull edges. Occasionally you have very sharp edges, but in the middle you have dull sections, which is very weird. This one just is dull from the base all the way to the tip. There's nowhere that's apexing away that's ready for practice and competition cutting. When I recover from this injury, I'll sharpen this edge and I do some follow-up test cutting and the report of its handling. Right now, I get a chance to do some dry handling with the sword before my injury happened. I can say that it's quite nimble for such a imposing large sword. The characteristics kind of remind me of the Albion Baron, one in the corner, and the Albion Maximilian. So both of them are very wide, broad, cutting-oriented war swords, two-handed swords, right? This one weighs about 10 ounces lighter than the Albion Baron, even though it has a blade 1 inch longer and hilt 2 inches longer, right? And it weighs about 2/3 of the weight as the Albion Maximilian. That's not really a surprise, right? That one is a very large Germanic two-handed sword from the end of the 15th century. So it's no surprise that this sword is much easier to maneuver. You can see even now with very limited range of motion, I can just use this very effectively. However, because of the minimal profile taper, it has a very good distal taper, right? Tapered from 6.4 millimeters down to 2.8. And it's concave distal taper, meaning that in the bottom portion, it tapers far more in the thickness. At the midpoint, it's down to 3.8 millimeters already. So the entire upper half of the blade is quite thin. You can flex this blade, you can see some flexibility, mostly happening in the last 1/3 of the blade, right? It's properly rigid. It's not, the blade does not sag at all when you hold it this way. So flexible, but not floppy, okay? Has a good amount of flex because this is quite a long blade, right? Even though it weighs only 1.5 kilograms, or 3 pounds 5 ounces, there's still some steel, right? Some mass out here, right? Almost a meter long blade from your hand. So having such a long grip, long hilt, this grip alone is 11 inches long. You have a lot of leverage to maneuver this very large sword. So I expect it to cut really well. But also, it has a lot of agility, right? And do not underestimate the agility and speed of Irish swords. They usually are very forward balanced, not forward heavy, but forward balanced, because the pommel is like hollow, right? So there's not a lot of mass. This one, the ring is large, even though it's not very thick. This amount of counterweight is still at the end of a very long lever because of the long grip. So the point of balance is actually very reasonable at 5 inches from the hilt, whereas the Lockwood Irish warsword has a balance around 6¼ inches from the hilt. So definitely feels more forward weighted, right? Forwardly balanced, right? This one is more balanced, right? You can have better precise control of the tip. Also, just coming back is easier. But if you compare this sword to my Albion Regent, which is a very typical Western European longsword of mid to late 15th century, yeah, there's no comparison, right? The weight is almost identical, 1.5 kilograms on both swords, but the Regent is much nimbler because of the very, very pronounced profile taper, right? What's interesting about this Balaur Arms Irish warsword and the Albion Regent is that at the base, they are both 2 inches wide, right? 5 centimeters. And even in the bottom half, the rate of tapering in the width is quite similar, right? Here, at the midpoint, is tapered down to 37 millimeters already, which is almost the same as the Albion Regent. However, if you look at the blade, in the top half of this blade, it almost stopped tapering, even though it's not like a parallel edges here. It has very little, right? At 2 inches from the tip, it's at 32 millimeters wide, whereas the Albion region is only half of that width, right? It's at 16 millimeters wide. So it's very tapered for thrusting, but also for speed and precision on the Albion region, whereas this one ensures the width for maximum cutting potential, because a wider blade, wider and thinner, you can have a longer bevel, right? So the angle of the edge is smaller. The blade will meet less resistance. Also, this blade has a lot of distal taper to offset that, so you can still have very good speed, tip speed, right? Not to mention it's very long. So yeah, it definitely focuses on cutting rather than balance between cut and thrust on the Albion region. By the way, the Albion region has a little bit more distal taper than this one because it starts out very thick at almost 9 millimeters. This one, however, is more akin to the likes of Albion Baron and Albion Maximilian, just over 6 millimeters. So that's quite adequate for distributing the mass on this blade in a way that balance the authority and the ease of redirection. Like if you want to do a feint and then cut from another direction, no problem at all, right? Also, make the entire sword not very heavy. I don't know why this very unique fullerless lenticular cross section throughout is not very popular on the reproduction market, which I say it's not popular. You almost never see them, right? Whereas back in history, they appeared a lot. So I'm just over the moon about all the design choices made on this model. And there are some quirks, like the transition from the extremity of the quilon to the central part, the thickness of the side facets on the hexagonal grip. But overall, these are just very minor complaints. The biggest one is really the lack of sharpness, right? You can fix that, but you really shouldn't. Other than that, this sword is just it's close to perfection. Right? Also, the sword steel is made of a British high silicon, high manganese steel, and is heat treated in a way by LK Chen that we know is going to be very, very durable. And based on Master Jensen's destructive review of numerous LK Chen swords using this steel. So yeah, what's not to like? And below $500, this is really a steal. And I think the other model was released alongside this Irish sword. The Renaissance size sword is also an excellent sword. Just the historicity part that's somewhat dubious, right? Questionable. But if you don't care about that, go for it. I'm pretty sure you're gonna be satisfied. Call to the Cena, LK Chen, if you see this video, please make sure the next iteration fix the sharpness, the apexing really, of the edges, but also the side facets thickness of this grip. I will do a follow-up review of this sword with cutting after I sharpen the blade, so stay tuned. Also, look forward to my upcoming video, the evolution of medieval longswords, clawhammer longsword, LK Chen's 倭妖刀 and Tang Dynasty 战马刀. That's it. And if you enjoyed this video, find any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.